just use the timer to set that same signal. So you don't have to use acceleration to drive the springs. You can use a timer, you can use paint on the ground, anything you want. So that's pretty prevalent in that shot. There's another class of shots that we had in the film were these axiom tilt shots, where we had that big spaceship that tilts over, and you have 8,000 agents slide out of their chair. And this is very tricky because you have so many agents, and there's a lot of very visible behavior. So while we did use the same brain springs, we needed real physics for this. And here's an example of what we did. We used rigid body dynamics, so that when the ship tilts, these agents are mounted by just boxes and spheres, and they have little springs where their chairs are. So they don't collide with their own springs, but they sort of plinko off the other springs and sort of bounce around through there. And the reason this is very quick is because we, rather than using the full geometry of the agents, we approximated them by just a box and a sphere. And if you just use boxes and spheres, rigid body simulation can be very fast. And rigid bodies are, there's ways to do this in both Maya as well as Houdini and probably many other programs. So that was the way we got the overall physics. However, that's just for the root motion. We need to get acting in there as well. So the idea is to use physics to drive action. Now, using the same principles of measuring acceleration, you can tell if a character is bumping into another character, or bumping into a chair, moving forward, moving backward, which direction they're getting bumped. And that's just measured through acceleration. Again, think about your smartphone. You know the program, if you shake it, something happens. So same thing. If you want to detect if your iPhone got hit on the left, like that, that's an acceleration to the right. Hit on the right, you know, it's acceleration to the left. So you can detect, by measuring the physics of this rigid body simulation, which animation clip to play to make it look like these characters are bumping around. Now this next thing is going to look ridiculous, but these are some clips of a character getting hit in various directions. From the left, from the front, from the back, you know, so on. And note that in WALL-E, originally, you know, in the end, the film was set 700 years in the future. In the beginning, it was supposed to be something like 7 million years in the future. So humans have evolved to the point where they have no legs. So the original human characters looked like this. So that's why that character looks a little odd. But in the end, that is the sort of, this is the system we use. So if you have those clips, if you just use a single cycle without using the accelerations to blend between these, it just looks like this. So he's getting pushed back, but it doesn't look real. It looks like some kind of balloon, you know, where he just takes that. But if we use that acceleration and use that to blend between clips of animation, then check it out. It now looks like he's being kicked from the front. He's kind of bending as a result. It looks a little weird at the end, but for big forces, you can get it look like they're reacting to the force just by blending between clips based on animation. And here's an extreme test where we really tipped them. They look like, oh my God, they're falling, they're rolling, they're dead. So in the end, the ship did not tilt this quickly, but this was an early test we did to see if it looked like they were reacting to the physics in the film. So that was an early test. Here's an example of a more realistic shot, you know, or a shot in the film where we use this, where this, where the axiom is tilting backwards and they're all sliding a little, waving their arms. So first, again, we did a rigid body simulation. Kind of looks like this, where we actually did the simulation on the tilted axiom. Rather than tilting the ground geometry, which is more expensive for rigid body, we actually animated gravity. You can see that green arrow on the top left. That's actually the gravity direction field changing. So we actually animated gravity to make them fall out, which is kind of funny. But you can do whatever you want in 3D. And so we did it. Then what we did is we set up our agents to go from flailing a little bit to flailing a lot, then coming to a rest, so that they would that'd be roughly tied to the tilt of the ship. And then we put them on the positions of the rigid bodies that we animated. And this looked a little bit jittery, so what we ended up doing is filtering the simulation quite a bit so that it looked a little smoother. And that's an example of the positions where we filtered it. And actually, the more filtering, the more it looked like they were sort of flowing as opposed to being very rigid. And then there is the final shot without lighting, where we've done some animation fix up on the front characters to have some specific acting. And that's the final shot. Alright, so for this part of the talk of this head of WALL-E, the conclusion is rendering out of Massive helped us scale up to a very large size. However, I think it was a little overkill transferring the rigging. That process we did was very difficult, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it. However, signal processing is a cool way to get fake physics, and if, it's worth considering if you ever need really fast springs. And a lot of people worked on this. So, next up, moving forward in history, we have the film Up, where we have lots of dog crowds. So the challenge was a little different on Up. We only had 50 dogs. That's not 50 in that image, but that's actually fairly small for a crowd. So we actually didn't have to use that complicated WALL-E rendering out of Massive pipeline. We could use more like what we did on Ratatouille, where we could bring them back into our own animation software. Where the challenge came from was the fact that the terrain was very complicated. We had lots of rocks and boulders. We also had lots of close-ups. You know, it's the same thing in every film. So let me skip the next two slides. But first thing we did is we had did a reference shoot where we took a bunch of employee dogs, went to a park north of Pixar in Albany, California. And it's not really a park, it's actually a landfill. But a lot of people bring their dogs there. And it had some very rocky terrain, so you could see how actual dogs react to it. Unfortunately, they don't react very well. These dogs, these are beasts that are very dedicated, but they had trouble. Don't worry, it was okay. But we noticed dogs had trouble going over rocky terrain. So we actually called the shoot off at this point. So we looked at a bunch of other references too, but we had to figure out, this was good because it actually allowed us to plausibly slow them down and let Carl and the bird escape them at first. But we used a lot of reference to see how their bodies kind of moved in reaction to the rocks. So we ended up creating, we also need a lot of pack dynamics. A system for fairly flexible navigation where we can use many different types of sources to make the agents move. So in this part of the course, you're going to be able to see a little bit about what sort of information you have in Massive to make agents react to their environment and each other. First thing we have is what we call sound. Agents each can emit a sound that sort of tell you where they are and how far they are from each other, as well as the obstacle of the environments that emit sound. And that's like one of the easiest ways to have agents avoid each other, an obstacle. So in this case, that agent sees there's a very close sound on the right, slightly further sound to the left. So it's going to turn a little more in one direction versus the other. So it's going to go like a little bit in the middle based on where those sounds are coming from. Similarly, leader following. Usually packs of dogs have a leader, kind of an alpha dog. So you really want to follow the alpha or follow the prey, potentially. So we use sound to sort of say, hey, that's where we should go. They all orient towards the leader. However, for some kind of obstacles, like irregular rocks, it's hard to model them with sound. The sound comes from, at least in Massive, comes from a single source. Whereas these rocky obstacles are very irregular shape. You can't really approximate them with lots of different sources. They'll end up actually going through the rocks. So what we did is we used a feature of Massive called Vision. Vision is sort of like image processing. When you render an image from the perspective of each character and use that to determine which way they go. So in that character on the right, he's looking forward, and in his field of view, he sees more pink on the left than on the right. And the brain is very simple. It says, if there's more pink on the left, turn right. If there's more pink on the right, turn left. Basically counting pixels. And with that, you can get a little thing like that where on the left is sort of what the dog sees. On the right is the agent navigating between them. It allows the agent to get very close to the rocks, yet still avoid them, which is the behavior we observe with dogs and wolves. They don't really avoid obstacles. They cut the corners as close as possible while trying to get their prey. So we found this really allowed accurate motion. Note how the camera is going up and down, up and down. It was constrained to the head. That actually gave us some noisy results. We ended up creating a little steady cam where we counter animated the camera to the head of the character. That gave us some better information where we can now cut even closer to the rock. And you can see how this is similar to robotics. You know, if you, again, you put a smartphone on the front of a car and you wanted that car to automatically avoid things, you'd have to do something similar, where you have to do sort of image processing. And if for instance, you could have a car that just avoided pink, so it could avoid taxis, right? You guys didn't get that joke. Anyway, it's sort of like robotics to move them around. The other thing that we have is cliff and wall avoidance. We actually had little probes in front of the characters that could cast a ray downwards and detect how far it's going. It's kind of like sonar. And it can detect if all of a sudden there was a big change in those probe distances, it would know there would be a cliff or a wall on the left or right, and it could turn accordingly. There's also one more thing where we can figure out the average orientation of the characters around the agent and use that to help stabilize the orientation so they all go in similar motion. So with all those different types of information, we had a couple different sort of looks. So this is a look of following flow fields and using sound signals. And the way the dogs are running, it looks kind of fluid. Not necessarily how dogs are. I mean, it's plausible, but they don't look very goal-directed. They look more like they're trying to avoid obstacles. Whereas instead, when we started using more leader following and vision, we got these very goal-directed packs of dogs that really cut corners and looked a little more believable. So we had the options of using all those different types of navigation to help them do their, to help them reach their goals and to direct them, basically. So this is a little technical, but the way this worked is we have all these sources, input from avoidance, leader following, collisions, cliff avoidance, and by default we just do a weighted average of them all. We can just tune the weight of one versus another, so you can say, oh, you're more likely to avoid your neighbor than to avoid a cliff or something. But it turns out that wasn't really enough control. Sometimes you wanted one type of behavior to always override another. So we created what we call precedence through inhibition. We might have some connection where, like, if you reach a cliff, don't go off the cliff. That's the most important thing. So stop caring about the leader at that point, or stop trying to avoid something. And we can sort of create these chains where one sort of behavior would inhibit another behavior. This is kind of like how actual brains work, because neurons have inhibitory connections between them sometimes. But anyway, it's just basically a way to control them. I'm gonna skip over. All right, I'll show this part. So another thing we noticed is sometimes at very high speeds, the dogs would change their decisions too quickly. They say, I'm going to go left, I'm going to go right, left, right, and they look like they'd actually start to freak out. Look, as they get close to the camera, some of the dogs start like twitching a little bit. And that's because the forces are so strong, they just think left, right, left, right, left, right, real quickly. And maybe for rats that's okay, but dogs don't change their minds that quickly. So it looks a little odd. So we created a technique that we called predictive understeering. And the way it works is sort of like how a thermostat works. If you're trying to control the temperature, you usually set a goal temperature. But when the house heats up or cools down, Thailand probably more cooling down, you don't want it to, as it reaches the goal temperature, switch on and off over and over again. that will actually burn out the switch, and it would be very power inefficient. Usually, you let it cross the threshold until it gets to a certain point, then it crosses again, so that it sort of oscillates very slowly around the goal temperature, rather than crossing back and forth. So we ended up using hysteresis, or hysteresis, I don't know how it's pronounced, but we used the same way a thermostat worked for the way our dogs chose which direction they were going. This is what massive looks like. It's a bunch of nodes connected to each other. Don't worry about that. But that's how we implemented hysteresis in massive. And that helped us eliminate that effect. The other thing we wanted to do is get better speed control so that we could really change the speeds of the dogs, have them look natural. And one way you might think to first do this is actually change the rate at which they're running. So, run at 50% speed, run at 200% speed. The problem with that is they stop looking like dogs at a certain amount of speed variation. So, as the terrain gets greener, this dog is running slower, but it's just rating it down, and by the end, that dog looks like it's running underwater. The legs are moving too slowly, given its gait. Rather, dogs tend to change their gait, from a trot to a bound, to change their speed, rather than just, slowing or speeding up. It's kind of like changing the pitcher, the speeding up or slowing down voices just by, increasing the playback rate. It doesn't quite work. So rather we did motion blending, where we would blend between different animation cycles animated at different speeds, and based on the desired speed, we blend between a couple. Again, I'm going to show you an unnecessarily complicated screenshot of Massive, where we implemented this gear shifting sort of process, where we blend between these. And here's before, again, where it sort of slows down at the very end, looking a little natural, and after, where we change to a different gait. In fact, the legs actually move faster at the end, because it's taking shorter strides. But that's how you go downhill. You don't take big steps when going downhill. You usually shorten your stride. Take smaller steps. Whereas before, we had, again, those big steps, but unnatural slow speed. So bad animation, good animation. The motion blending, where it goes to those on short strides. Note, we also did ground locking, where if the feet went through the ground, we'd have a program that would move the IK handles up, and it's not that interesting. The feet are just always above the ground. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you is sort of the limits about what you can do with crowd simulation in Massive with these kind of dogs. Running over a flat terrain with rocks is fine. But when you had a big boulder cascade, that's when things get hard. So I'm going to show you a screenshot of Massive that you'll find probably very amusing. So here are the dogs going downhill. I'm just showing spheres for each dog. And where the ground is colored different colors, that's telling them to play different animation cycles and blend between them. What we want to do is first make sure the motion looks right without the cycles. And we had this funny render where they look like eggs. That wasn't actually very helpful. But really what we're getting is many different animation clips blending together. And finally, there they are, going downhill. And with the animation, and look, there's the balloons in front of us. And this actually was a very hard shot to do, believe it or not. I looked through my footage earlier, and on this, and I think I tried this 173 times before I got it right. So it's really hard to do shots that are this close. This is about the point where you might want to animate them all by hand. But it's very tricky. This is still a hard problem to get agents going over very irregular terrain. And of course, after lighting, you barely see anything. So watch out where you spend your money. But anyway, so those are the ways we did some animation on those are some of the people that helped out. Now, next up I want to show you about Toy Story 3, Death by Monkeys. This is another kind of crowd shot at the extreme end of the spectrum, where there's so many of them, it's more like an effect or an explosion of fluid than it is individual characters. So yeah, that's the storyboard, and then we went over. So we went from that to those final Death by Monkey shots. So this is one where it was such a specific kind of crowd. We ended up not using mass or the other systems. Rather, because this crowd looked more like a fluid, we actually used fluid simulation to do a mushroom cloud, and then we had vected the monkey particles through the fluid, including for the shockwave as well. And this was largely done originally with Maya fluids, but then some of it with Houdini to retime it. But the idea was, you don't have to worry about animation of individual characters when it's at this scale. This is pretty much a fluid sim. And again, yeah, it was done with Maya fluids, retimed in Houdini chops. And yeah, so that was the Death by Monkeys. For this shot, this is a very different type of crowd shot. We had a lot of these background toys. This is actually a very hard crowd shot, believe it or not, to do any kind of trick to get the job done. The reason is, every character has a different rate and topology. Some have 2 arms, some have 3 arms, some are hamburgers, some are octopi, if that's the plural for octopus, some are cars. There was no way we could take an animation clip and reuse it from one character to another. So this is the kind of shot where it's all animated by hand. No technical tricks can be used. Fortunately, there weren't that many. Same thing with the background kid shots on Toy Story. There weren't really enough of them to justify creating a library of animation clips to reuse. They're doing very site-specific behavior. Some are playing with toys, some are painting, I don't know, they're all different kinds of things. But, so this was not really done with any kind of crowd pipelines, just animated by hand. So Toy Story was very different from the other films, Toy Story 3, where for the Death by Monkeys, that was more of an effect shot, we used fluid sim. But for those close-up shots, we just hand animated it, and it was few enough shots that was okay. Now for Cars 2, that was a lot more of what we had earlier, where we used Massive to do a locomotion of the cars, and we also again used shrink wrapping to do the rendering. So I actually didn't want to say much about, hold on. I know why I didn't have much on that. It's because I actually have a separate presentation on Cars 2, where I can show you guys. So, one of these is for Cars. Final Cars. Alright, so while that opens, any questions on Bugs Life through Toy Story 3? Crowds.
I want to ask you, is the crowd generated first, then the texture is done, or a texture is applied and then you animate the crowds?
So usually you could start them at the same time, but a shot cannot be final until the shading is done. So we can start building the tools in the pipeline and working on the overall motions. But especially if you want to make sure the crowd is diverse enough, clothing color is more, usually is more significant to make crowds seem diverse than, say, limb proportions and things like that. So we can't actually tell if the crowd is unique enough until we have shading. So it's actually very important to get that early on. All right. One second. Presentation. Oh, it's on the other screen. That always gets me. All right. So we're going to start on Cars 2 now. Any other questions before we pick up the Cars 2? All right. So again, in this film, quite a few crowd shots, a lot of traffic. Crowds running away, crowds at a party, crowds at the stadium, and like all the crowds that we talked about earlier, we have to use that shrink wrapping technique. Oh, here's a funny statistic. There were more polygons in the main character, Lightning McQueen, than there were an entire section of stands in it. So that was the advantage we got from shrink wrapping. I'm not going to dwell too long on that, but in terms of the story and aesthetic, what we wanted to do on Cars 2 was make sure the crowds were very location specific. When we were in, say, England,